Well, good morning. Welcome to our Why Use the Work of Leaders profile session. And obviously, it's an everything disc profile. And the main focus of what I want to do today is to talk to people who are doing leadership development to understand how the Work of Leaders profile can fit into your current leadership development efforts. Okay, so first of all, where does the work of leaders come from? And it's actually come from research, a culmination of 6 years of research and development. The Work of Leaders book presents a simple structure that neatly captures the complexity of contemporary leadership. All right. So the profile came first, came out of the research that was done, and then the book was written. The book is actually a lot of stories about how companies have used the Work of Leaders model to create more effective leaders. So that book is also available, well, probably on Amazon, but through Wiley, and we have some in stock here if you want one. Okay. All right. So what is contemporary leadership? Okay, as opposed to traditional views of leadership. I think the traditional view of leadership was that managers manage things or tasks and leaders lead people. So leaders was very people oriented. Well, it's more than that. And Jim Collins, author of Good to Great, talked about level 5 leadership and posed a very different idea of what leaders do, what they are. Great leaders have humility and professional will. They take responsibility, they ask for help, they have discipline and passion, and they surround themselves with the right people. And he emphasizes in the book that the right people are the people with the right values, not necessarily the people with the right competencies. Okay? Because if you've got the right values, you can learn the competencies. The second example of more current thinking about leadership comes from Marcus Buckingham, formerly the Gallup organization, went out on his own, and he published a book called The One Thing You Need to Know. And he says there that the leader's job is to rally people toward a better future. Driven by their compulsion for a better future, their challenge is to do everything in their power to get other people to join together to make this future come true. By contrast, he says that managers get the best out of each individual, right? They discover what is unique about each person and capitalize on it. And the difference he's talking about here is a difference in personality, okay? So leaders take a group of people somewhere they've never been before, right? In terms of performance or in terms of changing the organization, changing products or whatever it might be, okay? They create change. And so obviously they need to get individuals to come along as well. And that's where the management profile comes in. The individual skills you need to have to make sure each person is able to perform what they need to do to achieve that vision. Okay. So that's really the distinction that Wiley made in creating this profile was managers focus on one-on-one relationships and leaders focus on a group and moving a group forward. And unlike the management profile, which uses only the DISC assessment to generate the profile, right? The DISC questions and the priority questions. In the Work of Leaders profile, there are an additional 72 questions which participants respond to, which measures the degree to which the leader is using 18 best practices. Okay, so what are those best practices? Okay, well, they fall into 3 categories or 3 stages. All right, so what do great leaders do? They come up with a vision of new possibilities for the future. And it gives us a hint there that they do that through exploration, boldness, and testing assumptions. And we'll have a look at those in more detail in a second. All right. So once we've got the vision, then we need to get alignment for that vision. So that's the second stage in the process. So building alignments by communicating clearly, engaging in dialogue, and providing inspiration so that everybody's moving in the same direction towards achieving the vision. And then once we've got the alignment, of course, we need execution. And so great leaders champion execution through momentum, structure, and feedback. And that's what we want to go through today. Now, I want to emphasize here that what I want to focus on, as the title of this webinar suggests, is that using it for leadership development. And there are other applications of the work of leaders profile, but I'm thinking here of a situation where you've got a group of leaders that you're taking through a leadership development process of some sort. And where does the work of leaders profile fit into that? All right, I'm not suggesting it's the be all and end all to leadership development. There's a lot of other things you could do, and I'll talk a little bit about some other things that you could do later on, and to capitalize on the work of leaders profile. So when the leader takes the work of leaders profile, first thing they're doing is taking the DISC questions. Now, if they've already done a workplace profile or a management profile, you can use existing data to generate the work of leaders profile so that their dot falls in the same place. All right. But the narrative here is specifically focused on you as a leader. So you'll see the third paragraph down. This is my profile. It says, like other leaders with the SI style, you focus on leading collaborative efforts. Okay. So it's a very different narrative here than what you would have in your workplace profile. Okay. And that's because it's application focused. And also, we would typically do the usual tick, cross, question mark, underline, as we're taking people through their profile. Okay, and of course, like all of the other everything DISC profiles, the ones that you do through EPIC, page 5 is the priorities. And like each other profile, the priorities are unique to that application. So you'll see quite clearly here that the wording of the priorities around the outside is very different from what is in the workplace profile, and it's also different from what's in the management profile. Okay, and so like the other DISC profiles, you can also have an extra priority, as I have here on the pioneering scale. And of course, we would cross question mark here, but I don't want to go into all of that detail today. All right, so I'm going to skip to my supplement report here for a moment, because the supplement becomes really important in interpreting someone's work of leaders profile. So if you're facilitating a group of people through the work of leaders profile, you want to make sure that you've got a copy of their supplement, and obviously you would give them a copy as well as part of your debrief. Now, this is my umbrella graph, right? And you can see that I've got a big spike on the DIID scale, and I'm going to come back to that a little later, because I'm actually an SI style, as you'll see in the next slide. All right, that's where my dot is. And I've got extra striped shading on the pioneering priority. Okay, and that striped shading is not actually because of the spike on my DIID scale. Now, because I've got that spike, I may actually place a higher priority on action than if I didn't have that. But it's actually my priority subscales, and you'll see the pioneering priority, I've scored up to 100%, which matches my affirming priority and my inclusive priority, okay, as being my strongest priorities. I'm also fairly strong in energizing, but that's because it's allocated as one of my 3 from where my dot is, okay? And these become significant when we start looking at the best practices and how the leader has scored on those best practices. And I'll show you some examples as we go through that. So now let's go to the work of leaders model. We've already talked about vision, alignment, execution, and there are 3 drivers for each. And for each driver, there are 2 best practices. All right. So this is the 6 years of research. This is what it identified. This is what great leaders do. They craft a vision, they build alignment, and they champion execution. And how do they do that? What do they need to do that? And they use the best practices. There's 18 of them. All right. And so when the leader is taking the work of leaders profile, they answer 72 questions about themselves. It's self-assessment. But there's 4 questions for each of the 18 best practices. Okay. And so getting a fairly accurate plot as to where they sit on each of these best practices. So when we'll see the subscales in a moment, or the best practices on a scale in a moment. But being at the high end of the scale is the ideal place to be here. It's not, doesn't matter where you are, because if you want to be a great leader, you've got to use these best practices, so you need to be strong in them. Okay. And so let's dive into the first one, which is vision. And I want to highlight here, halfway down this, I'm not going to go into all the detail because we don't have time for that. You'll see halfway down, there's a heading that says leaders at all levels craft the vision. Okay. And so while we do think of vision coming from top down typically, and yes, the CEO may be responsible for the overall vision of the organization, or the CEO and the leadership team, but there's the leader of a department, like say a customer service manager, has a customer service team with some call center groups, okay? And that leader can certainly have a vision for their department, of what they see their department achieving or being in the future, all right? So this profile is designed for leaders at all levels and can be used in that way. And we'll talk about that as we see each section. All right, so the two best practices for exploration, and that's the first thing we need to do to come up with a vision, is explore all the possibilities. All right, and the first one is to remain open, and the second is to prioritize the big picture. All right, and so if you fall the seek closure into the scale, you'll limit the time you spend on exploring things and looking for all the best options, because you want to close off and get started. All right. And if you prioritize the details, you will be avoiding looking at the big picture stuff and just wanting to look at the details. All right. So what happens when you're taking leaders through this profile is you get people who fall at the seek closure or prioritize details end of the scale. And you need to help them understand that we're talking about when you're exploring for a vision here. Yes, there's going to be times where we need to prioritize the details, but not while we're exploring for a vision. Okay. In the book, The Work of Leaders, there's some quotes from the research that was done on thousands of leaders to identify what the best practices were. And they published a couple of pieces of research here. And I thought this was interesting and worth sharing with you. Which of the following do you find more difficult? Making sure I remain open to all possibilities without closing off my options too quickly? Or do I find it more difficult to close off options so that we can have a clear direction? Okay, 65% of the leaders surveyed, a few thousand of them, said I have more difficulty remaining open to all possibilities. So majority of leaders are more likely to close off their exploring because they want to move forward with it. Okay, and that'll show up in the results of their profile. And then the second, and I'm not going to go through all of the best practices because I can't do that in the time we've got allocated. I want to highlight some key things that you would want to think about if you're using this as a tool for leadership development. All right, and so the boldness is the two best practices of being adventurous and speaking out, put yourself out on a limb and sharing your vision or your ideas. Okay. And of course, the opposite end of the scale there is cautious. Now, you're going to have some cautious people going through leadership development, all right? And they're going to fall down the cautious end of the scale. And the reason this works so well is when you're answering the questions, taking the assessment, if you're a cautious person, you see the positive answers to the questions as showing that you're cautious. So your dot's going to end up down the bottom end of the scale, as we'll see in the team example we've got a bit later. And there's nothing wrong with being cautious, except when you can't try to come up with a bold vision. All right. And that's when we need to be more adventurous. We need to stretch ourselves and move up the other end of the scale. We'll talk a little bit about how to do that a little bit later. Okay. So, and as you can see, I fall pretty strongly on this adventurous and speaking out. And this is where I want to come back to for a second, to that spike on the DI scale. All right. So my unexpected items and all the things that result in my umbrella graph being the way they are contribute to where I fall on these scales. Okay, an SI style would probably not typically be so strong on adventurous or speaking out for that matter. Okay, so important to keep that supplement in mind when you're doing this. The last driver in vision is testing assumptions. And there are two things here. One is seeking counsel, that is, getting input from other people about the vision before you finalize it. And the second one is exploring implications. Before we jump into embarking on this vision, have we done the research to check out whether there are some risks that we need to be aware of? Okay, because we're talking about creating change, all right? My natural tendency is to push forward rather than explore implications here. And I'm okay on seeking counsel. That's something I enjoy collaboration, okay? So that's going to show up in my profile and also perhaps in my unexpected items. And the push forward's probably contributed to a lot by that spike on the DI scale as well, okay? So just some more research here on testing assumptions. The people who were surveyed for the development of this profile were asked, how many people do you seek counsel from at work? And especially when you're crafting a vision. Almost half the leaders felt that they were expected to make decisions on their own. And I think there's probably a lot of leaders that you know that would feel that that's what they're supposed to do. I'm a leader. I'm supposed to make the decisions. All right. Almost 40% don't seek counsel because they prefer to trust their own instincts. Okay. So as you can imagine, seeking counsel might be a bit of a challenge for a lot of leaders. All right, so let's dive into alignment. I'm not going to cover as much of this, just to explain what's in here. First of all, alignment is for leaders at all levels. So gaining alignment and having the skills to do that, being able to use the best practices that will get alignment, obviously is very important for people at all leadership levels, okay? And as you can see in this, communicating the vision with clarity is not a strength of mine, all right? The two best practices are explaining rationale and structured messaging. I'm more inclined to just get all excited about my vision and share my fantastic ideas with people without explaining the rationale behind it, because people are thinking, well, why are we doing this? Why are we changing again? All right. And if I don't address that, they're not going to buy in. Okay. I will not get their alignment. And so I tend to be more impromptu in my messaging rather than thinking it through and structuring the messaging so that it all makes sense. And I've covered the details. Okay. The second driver of alignment is dialogue. And here we exchanging perspectives, listening to other people's input and being receptive to challenges that people may have. All right. And then there's the inspiration side of it, which I'll cover a little bit later in another part, but that's the third driver, expression and inspiring people to get on board with this vision. Okay. This is something that obviously people who struggle with remaining open and are also going to have to struggle with being receptive to other people's ideas or concerns or challenges about what you're communicating. Okay, so then we go on to execution, which is the third stage. And again, execution is for leaders at all levels. Need to make sure that we're executing on our plans to achieve the vision. All right, and so part of it obviously is planning. And so that's one of the best practices, is coming up with a plan to achieve the vision, which also probably means analyzing in depth. And as you can see, this is not a strength of mine. And obviously I'm, as the leader of an organization, I'm in the position to be able to make sure I've got people on the team who are very good at that. But I need to make sure I know who they are and I allow that to happen. All right. And instead of improvising and forcing everyone else to improvise, we need to make sure we're getting a plan going. All right. And then feedback is one of the other drivers of execution. And I think this is a really interesting one, because there's two kinds of feedback we need to provide. We need to address problems and we need to offer more praise. They're the two best practices. As you can see, and this is where my SI style comes in, I tend to want to maintain harmony rather than bring up problems and address problems and make sure people are aware of the problems and that we're sorting them out, all right, which is something that I need to work on, okay, and make sure I've got other people on the team who are very good at that, and I do, which is great, okay. I don't have any problem offering more praise. That comes very naturally to me as an SI style, okay. But what's interesting here is if you look at address problems, the style that would be most effective at doing that would be the DCCD style, okay, or the resolute leader in the work of leaders model, resolute priority, and or indelible will, as Jim Collins called it, the strong will to make sure we're staying on track, okay. And so in order to be effective at giving feedback as a leader, I need to do both. That is, I need to operate on the DC scale and focus on addressing the problems and making sure we're moving forward and staying with it. And I also need to be on the SI scale and Ayers scale to offer more praise, which is something that they're naturally good at. Okay, so the degree of adaptability required to be a great leader is obviously high. Okay, so looking at this leader's self-rate, this again some data from the research that that we put together. People who felt they excelled at giving praise, 56%. Who excelled at addressing problems, 24%. And 7% thought they excelled at both of those. Okay, so 31% excel at addressing problems. That's not a surprise. Okay. Because people typically don't want to bring up issues. Now, the researchers then went on to ask them, what keeps you from speaking up about problems more often? The number one was political factors. The politics in my organization don't encourage people to speak up about problems. And then we had typical things like, I don't want to stir up tension. I have a non-confrontational personality style. I don't want to hurt people's feelings. I don't want to discourage people. It wouldn't actually improve things around here. I think that's a self-perception. And it means that I have to spend more of my time fixing problems. Okay. Or it's not my job. That's the big cop out. Okay. I guess it may be not part of someone's job, but if they're a leader, I'd question that. Okay. And so then in the back of the profile, it goes through all of the 18 best practices and identifies the 3 that you scored highest in. All right. And I scored at the end of the scale in the best practice side on more than 3 of the items, maybe 6 or 7. But it takes the first 3 that it comes to when it's going through the 18 best practices. All right, so you can go through all 18 in your profile to see where your strengths are. Anyway, okay, and of course we want to continue to use those strengths in your leadership development program. You want to make sure leaders know what their strengths are and to make sure they are using them. Some of them may not recognize their strengths as strengths, especially if there's a culture that's not encouraging them to be adventurous, for example. Okay. And then the leadership challenges. And there are 3 pages, one for each of the 3 challenges, which are the best practices that you scored lowest in. All right. And again, if you scored right at the end of the opposite end of the scale from the best practice on more than 3, you're only going to get the first 3 that it comes to as it goes through. So again, you can go through all of the 18 best practices and see, well, what are the ones I really need to work on and what are the priorities for that? So here are the 3 that I have in my profile. And, I learned pretty early on this explaining the rationale and structured messaging. I found someone on the team who was really good at that. And if I wanted to share a fantastic new idea with the team, I'd go and talk to them first and say, I've got this great idea. What are the questions that you're going to ask? And I'd share my idea and she would ask all these questions that I would never, ever think of. My mind just doesn't even go there. All right. And so that sort of helped me to make sure I was, but sometimes I'd say, well, maybe it's not such a good idea after all. Okay. So from here, you can help the leader to identify an action plan for working on the best practices that they feel would help them be more effective as a leader in their current role and what they're doing at present in that current role. Okay. So from a leadership development perspective, each individual is going to be working on their own development plan. Okay. And of course, you as a facilitator or leader of that can help them with that. Okay. And don't forget, the supplement needs to be part of that so people can see how this ties in with their DISC style. All right. Now, the other report that we have that is very helpful, especially if you're working with a group of leaders at the same time and they're all going through the work of leaders profile, because there's a facilitator report. All right. And so here we have a group of 8 people. A very quick overview. You can see the drivers here. Each driver, there's 2 best practices. Okay. And 79% of this group find it quite natural to do the exploration part. Only 54% on boldness and testing assumptions. Okay. And so we can see clarity is pretty good. Inspiration, very low. That's their lowest. And when we see the disc styles in a moment, we'll understand why perhaps this group was not so strong on inspiration. Okay. If I remember correctly, there was no one in the I style in this group. Okay, so that's just a quick overview. And then the report dives into each of the best practices to see what percentage of the team, or how much of the team scored high, medium, and low. And you can see that the remaining open, this group's pretty good. They've got a couple who are low, and then prioritizing the big picture, got 100% high. I thought that was astounding, especially when you see the disc styles, which we will see in a moment. But the other thing that's really interesting here is that it gives you specific feedback about each participant. So if you're working on leadership development with a group of people, you know who needs to focus on what. All right. And we can see that Ivor and Luna are more likely to seek closure than remain open. And we can see that we've got 5 people in the high area and 1 just below the high. So that's why remaining open was also quite strong for this group. And then likewise for prioritizing the big picture, we had all 8 of them high. Now let's look at the styles. Okay, no one in the I quadrant. We've got Owen Drake, B, is a DI style, so there's a touch of I there. But the rest of them are DC, CD, or CCS, and S. Okay, so there's obviously some flexibility there. If they're prioritizing the big picture, maybe there's a culture of big picture in that organization. People are encouraged to focus on the big picture. So that's my thoughts. I don't know who this group are. It's just a sample report. Okay, so let's look at some of the other. Let's look at boldness here, for example, and we can see that they're only average at being adventurous and speaking out. All right. So as a facilitator of leadership development, you'd be looking at that and saying, well, what do we need to do to get people to be less cautious? Right, because we've got 3 people who are low in being cautious. Okay, and so and we'll see that clearly when we go over here. And Luna's an S style. I think Georgiana's a CS style, etc. And the people who are adventurous are the DI and DC. So you can see how disc style does have an impact on how people respond to the best practice questions and how they score themselves. All right. And so that's important when it comes to adapting. All right. So to get Luna and Abram, who are really high on being cautious, to start being more adventurous, you're going to need to get them to look at the way they think. Now, this is where I think I haven't pulled anything into this to tie this in with the Agile EQ profile, but changing your mindset is what the Agile EQ is all about. All right, it's measuring how your disc style affects your mindsets, and the mindset for the DC style is resolute, right? And that ties in very nicely with the resolute leadership approach here in the work of leaders profile. So if you're going to be more bold, more adventurous, being more resolute or more self-assured would certainly help you. Okay, so that's something worth looking into, is how do I get these leaders to develop these best practices, to learn new mindsets. Okay, all right. So speaking out again, you'll see the same kind of thing. And again, Luna with the S style is down in the low area there. But what's interesting, when we go on to exploring implications, and I'm just going to skip to that. Seeking counsel obviously is very important. This group is only very average at that, but this group's much better at exploring implications. All right, and here we see Luna, who was very low on and very cautious, is now a bit of a star in exploring implications. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? You would think that the CS, S, and C styles would be very good at exploring implications, getting into the detail, analyzing things, getting the data, etc. And then the D styles, like Owen, just wants to push forward. Well, I've got my vision. I don't need to explore implications, and off we go. All right. The second area, just a couple of things on alignment. Again, communicating with clarity. Again, this team is sort of average at that. They're actually pretty good at structured messages as a whole. All right. And actually, the explaining rationale, the dots up pretty high too. It's only got 2 lows. So they're pretty good at that. And again, that makes sense. The C's and the S's in the group are going to be much better at communicating with clarity. And so you'll see the dots come up high on this one, and again on structured messaging. All right. I included this one. I haven't included everything, but also part of the communication part is inspiration. All right. And being encouraging. Only 2 members of the group do any encouraging. The other 6 are very low at this. Okay. And again, if you look back at their disc styles, that would tend to make sense. On to execution. In terms of planning, only average at that, the low average, all right, which is interesting, but very good at analyzing in depth. Everybody does some of that. Okay, no one low on that. So again, this would affect what kind of additional development work or training would I need to provide this group. And I could not necessarily provide the same training for everybody. All right, I can create some additional sessions, or you could create a session around the Agile EQ profile, and they choose the mindsets that they need to work on to improve in the best practices. Okay, and again, you see where everyone sits on the best practices. Okay, and then addressing problems or offering praise. All right, and this group is actually a little bit better at addressing problems because they're largely on the left-hand side of the disc map, aren't they? All right. But there are people who would prefer to maintain harmony, and they would need to work on specific things for them to develop a mindset of speaking up about problems, all right, which the resolute leader tends to do very well. Okay. All right. So the facilitator report also provides group strengths and then group challenges. All right. So that's additional information to help you to develop a plan for how you can help this team, if it's a team of leaders, or each individual within the group to increase their leadership development. You no doubt have other leadership development activities and things that you can implement within this model to help people increase their leadership adaptability. Okay, thanks everyone for being here. Really appreciate you taking the time out to join with us again, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. If obviously your questions, you can contact Intégro at support or on our phone number. Thank you.